The divided families are among the many painful legacies left by the division of the Korean Peninsula and the ensuing Korean War that has left an open wound for tens of thousands of Koreans who have not been able to reunite or even find out the whereabouts of their loved ones for the past 70 years. The outbreak of the war in 1950 with a surprise attack from the north prompted many Koreans to flee south in search of a safe haven from the mayhem. And those who fled their hometowns in the north, thinking they would be able to return once the war was over, were never able to do so, with the Iron Curtain only solidifying the division on the Korean Peninsula to this day. So in 1971, the South Korean Red Cross began fact-finding surveys on divided families. And after over a decade of negotiations with the North, the first ever family reunions materialized in 1985 in the form of exchange hometown group visits between Seoul and Pyongyang. But this pair of exchange visits between families in South and North Korea ended as a one-off with no additional reunions for another 15 years. It was only after the first ever Inter-Korean Summit in 2000 and its June 15 North-South Declaration where the two Korean leaders agreed to exchange visits by separated family members and relatives that formally paved the way for reunion programs to resume and be held on a regular basis. And the latest round of family reunions took place in the summer of 2018 after the April 2018 Panmunjom Declaration of the Inter-Korean Summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un. So far, a total of 21 in-person family reunions and 7 video reunions have taken place over the past 20 years, which is far too few to accommodate all the applicants seeking a chance to see their loved ones within their lifetime. Of the more than 133,000 applicants registered in that system, over 82,000 have already passed away, with the number of survivors standing at about 51,000 as of the end of June this year. In other words, over 60% of the divided families have already passed, and those remaining are also fast running out of time. In the process of selecting the families for the Inter-Korean government-sponsored reunions, the divided families in South Korea were able to learn about the status of some 60,000 relatives in the north, which is, better than nothing. Yet, fewer than 5,000 families, or 24,000 individuals in total, have been able to participate in these in-person family reunions held on Korean soil so far. That's roughly 18% of the total applicants. So when we do the math, an annual average of some 820 individuals were able to meet with their divided families over the past 20 years. At this rate, it would take some 60 years for the remaining applicants to get their turn for a reunion, and that is if the 70 and 80-something elderly can survive another 50 years. The biggest obstacle to this resolving this issue is the reluctance on the part of North Korea, which has resulted in intermittent reunions capped at 100 divided families from North and South Korea respectively, even when they do agree to host family events. And why is North Korea holding back? There are a number of reasons North Koreans balk at family reunions. First is North Korea takes a political approach to this fundamentally humanitarian issue. With South Korea surpassing North Korea in almost all aspects, except for nuclear arms, Pyongyang does not have much leverage over Seoul. And well aware that family reunions are among the most important inter-Korean projects sought after by the South, North Korea is not inclined to give away this valued bargaining chip very easily. But I think perhaps just as crucial to North Korea is that is a fear of the South Korean influence seeping in through more regular and direct contact between citizens and their relatives from the South. So for these reasons and more, North Korean authorities not only prep the families with the ideological sessions before the reunions, but also afterwards so as to drain any capitalistic ideas and influence that they may have come into contact with in the course of participating in these family reunions. Now, the future outlook, given such a reluctance and sensitivity on the part of the North Korean regime, family reunions are hosted only if and when Pyongyang feels the need to use them as a leverage to attain their other objectives. And if history is in any indication, family reunions were held most frequently in times of good and active inter-Korean relations, with long breaks or no reunions under icy relations. And that's why it's important to institutionalize family reunions as a humanitarian issue that does not get swayed by political climate or development. As North Korea has either ignored or refused to resolve this mutual humanitarian issue since the aborted nuclear negotiations with US President Trump in Hanoi in 2019, Seoul's Ministry of Unification earlier this year announced new ways to help the divided families seek private reunions directly with their relatives in the north. That is, by allowing and promoting private family reunions in the form of private tours to the north, Mount Kumgang or Kaesong. But with North Korea closing off its borders at the outbreak of the COVID-19 and only further aggravating the inter-Korean relations with aggressive rhetoric and action, most recently demonstrated in the explosion of the symbolic North-South Joint Liaison Office in Kaesong, it's really hard to see Pyongyang becoming forthcoming on this humanitarian issue of family reunions in the near future.
Well, the first point I'd like to make is that for some reason, many people know about Korean divided families, but very few people think about this as an American issue. Not just one that the US has at stake, but one that involves American citizens, including veterans, including other public servants. The second point I'd like to make in my remarks is we all know that Korean divided families are a very tragic issue. And there are other Korean divided families as well, including more recent North Korean defectors, adoptees, Zainichi Koreans in Japan who are repatriated, abductees, and finally, I would like to challenge everyone and encourage you all to think critically about the current mechanism we have for family reunions with North Korea. Given recent developments, especially with the pandemic, it seems that face-to-face reunions, again, as Soojin mentioned and as the South Korean government acknowledges, might not be the most efficient or effective way at achieving closure, which is something that I would like to end on. I think the point that I would like to illustrate here, in terms of giving an overview of Korean American divided families, is the sheer difficulty of accounting for Korean American divided families. So unlike South Korea, which keeps very robust statistics through the Ministry of Unification on both the ages, on the whereabouts, on both formal and informal reunion efforts, there's close to no information about Korean American divided families. So we see the number 100,000 being thrown around a lot. As we can see from what Soojin mentioned, over 60% of those registered on South Korea's registry have already passed away. And just the 98 people on Divided Family USA's private registry, they're quickly passing away as well. I think it's clear that time is running out for these Korean American divided families. What really struck me about a government survey from 2018 in South Korea, which showed that 92% of divided family members in South Korea expressed a desire to know what happened to the relatives in North Korea, while 75% expressed interest in participating in a reunion program in North Korea. What makes the issue of Korean American divided families distinct is that there has not been an official channel for face-to-face reunions, but also for reconnecting with their families in North Korea. So they've had to resort to two primary ways to try to reunite with their families. The first one has been with the North Korean government through informal ways. So there is a North Korean Workers' Party agency called the Association for Overseas Compatriots, which has a connection with a organization in the United States called the Korean American National Coordinating Council, KNCC. And over the past several decades, along with the DPRK mission to the United Nations in New York, which has served as a de facto diplomatic office, some Korean Americans have been able to connect and reunite with their family members. The other method has been through third-party brokers, either ethnic Korean Chinese or Joseonjok, or through brokers in other countries such as Canada. I do think, though, that since the early 2000s, there has been a strong level of U.S. governmental and grassroots support for U.S. North Korea family reunions. We've seen this in the North Korean Human Rights Act of 2004 and when it was renewed. We've seen this in language about Korean American divided families in the National Defense Authorization Act, in the Senate State Foreign Operations and Related Programs. We've seen this in most recently in two pieces of legislation which passed the House of Representatives in March of this year. The Divided Families Reunification Act, introduced by Representative Grace Meng, and HR 410, introduced by Representative Karen Bass. The North Korean government has been a primary challenge, presented obstacles in making reunions a reality, but North Korean governments and the officials have expressed interest in the past. It's just that the two sides have rarely aligned at the same time. What can we do now? And it's almost a given that we think that reuniting these families is something that we must do. But in some ways, I would just like to push back on this fact a little bit, because there have been studies, particularly by one scholar named James Foley, who has written an English language book on Korea's divided families, that this system of one-off, one-time reunions with minders from North Korea, with cameras from the media flashing everywhere from several different countries, might actually be counterproductive in achieving closure for divided families. So especially given the health risk concerned with face-to-face reunions, I want to keep pushing forward the government-to-government mechanisms of reunions. But I also want to encourage all the listeners here, I think, who come from various sectors, to think creatively about what we can do to provide closure for these divided families.